Good evening, everybody. I'm Liz Walker. It's been a while, but welcome to From the Heart, Searching for Healing and Hope, my live face stream that is my contribution to bring this fragmented world together. I have always, as a founder of Can We Talk and a minister of the gospel in the Presbyterian tradition, I've always been fascinated by the historical role of prophets played and how they worked in healing communities. Think of Isaiah, Elijah, all used prayer and fasting and healing afflictions in healing nations. You can think about Dr. Martin Luther King as a modern day prophet who talked about healing the world through racial justice and racial reconciliation. Well, I put our guest in that category today, and I am honored to welcome a man who's going to talk with me about whether we can heal our nation's broken heart now. Reverend Dr. John Wesley Walker is the retired pastor of Bethel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church in Sarasota, Florida. Reverend Walker is a social justice leader in issues like racial reconciliation, criminal justice reform, housing and educational reform, trauma healing. And if you're doing anything in the social justice arena in Sarasota, Florida, you want Dr. John there. So Micah, if you would bring our guest in, Dr. John Wesley Walker is my special guest tonight. A good friend. We call each other cuz, though I don't think there's any blood related.
I can take that further, but I'm not.
Thank you for joining me tonight on From the Heart, Dr. Walker. How do you define a social justice ministry? How do you look at that term?
Okay, thank you, cuz, for inviting me. And well, dealing with social justice, or how I see social justice, is addressing those social issues that affect the masses, those issues that oppress, disenfranchise, those issues that are systemic in our society or that is woven in the fabric of our country in particular, that keeps people apart, that keeps people under someone else's thumb, the policies and practices that we see constantly that need to be addressed as the prophets of old, as you spoke of, they need to be addressed and brought to the forefront. In essence, we always say we speak truth to power. Mm-hmm. And that's how I see social justice.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about a church that focuses on social justice, and Bethel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church certainly does, the CME denomination, I think, focuses on social justice. Yes. How do you distinguish that from other churches? And I'm not trying to say we're right and they're wrong. I'm just saying, what's a church that's not focused on social justice?
Yeah, you're so correct. We had a discussion with some of the probationers in our church, and I'm on that committee of ministerial examination. We talked about social justice preaching. It's in our book of discipline, as we would say. It speaks of social justice, social creed. From the beginning and the inception of the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, really most of the Wesleyan churches, I want to say that because that's what I'm a part of, always address social justice. It sets us apart because we were the only churches that were created, if you will, or started or established rather, based upon race. Most of the other churches were started because of doctrine. You preach one way or you're teaching another way. So therefore, I'm going to separate and start my own denomination, so to speak. Well, the AME Church, AME Zion Church, and the CME Church all started based upon race. The church, the Methodist Church South and North would not allow people of color or African Americans to worship or to participate in worship. In the AME Church, Richard Allen said, "Hey, forget y'all. We're going to start our own church." Right. And the Wesleyan tradition. Whereas 100 years later, the CME Church started, but they went to the General Conference and asked the bishops of that time to get their blessing to start their church because they were not allowed. So social justice and as it relates to racial issues have always been in the exception of the Wesleyan churches. And what makes that different is because we believe that's part of who we are as followers of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
I contend that you cannot be one unless you address social justice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's what Jesus taught.
I think it's ironic, and I never thought about it until you just said this. We became engaged in social justice because we had to.
Because we had to.
Because the racism and the systemic racism was thrust on us. You know, Malcolm X used to say, we didn't land in Plymouth Rock landed on us.
Yes,
and that's exactly what you're saying about our right and responsibility of worship and having, you know, religious freedom. We had to fight for that, right?
Right. And still fighting in a sense, in that our theology from a liberation context, you know, you have individuals from another perspective or another, how can I put this, wing of Christianity who would say our type of theology or our type of preaching is not biblical. You know, social justice or social gospel is not the gospel. And in actuality, if they read the gospel, I'm getting ahead of myself, but that's okay. We having a talk. When you talk about social gospel, that's what Jesus taught. That's what Jesus preached. That's what the prophets of, you know, they spoke of a social mandate for the Hebrews. And so to suggest that social gospel is not gospel, what you're doing is, and I've always asked this question to a lot of my colleagues, are we really following Jesus? Or are we following Paul? I ain't got nothing against Paul sometimes, but you know, are we, because they'll quote you Romans, they'll quote you the epistles, they will quote you everything but the gospel. But Jesus. And, you know, so I think that's my battle. That's my fight now.
Absolutely. And Jesus was a social justice advocate because he said, you got to take care of the least of these. You got to take care of those who are not taken care of by the system. How do people miss that, Pastor John? Why would there even be, to me, I don't even understand how there could be a debate because it's right there in the text.
Right. Because they don't want to address the issues that counters their, quote, belief systems. See, from a Western theology, and that's how we view America, that's how we view Christianity through Western eyes. We don't see it really through, and if you really have to go back to the prophets, you really have to go back to the Hebrew text. Really, you got to go back to Genesis through Revelations to see the social justice in the text. So you're saying, how do they miss that? It's because we preach, Western theology preaches personal salvation, not the salvation of the whole, not the salvation of the masses. So when Jesus preached what he preached, he was preaching from a context that was his heritage. He was preaching from a context that he grew up with the prophets, because when we talk about the Hebrew word for righteousness and justice, mishpat, I had to call my Hebrew rabbi friend. That was an oxymoron statement. But my rabbi friend to really get the true definition of a lot of Hebrew words. So mishpat and tzedek. Mishpat is justice, which means doing right by others, do justice for others. And righteousness was not a righteousness of self-piety, which we preach and which we teach today. Know Jesus and go to heaven. Know Jesus and be saved. Well, the Hebrew text says, be righteous, doing right to others, treat others, and it's about the whole. It's not about self-piety. It's about treating people with justice, treating people with righteousness. And that's how the community gauged an individual's holiness and righteousness based upon how they treated the community. So that's what Jesus taught. That's what Jesus preached.
Right.
And so when he saw the hungry, when he saw people who were being disenfranchised, people who he went to, he was just doing what the prophets of old, what the culture, his culture had trained him and taught him to do. So he was doing something that was normal to him.
And it's right there, as I said in the text. The other thing that gets me about it is when there are those who would say, no, we're not supposed to worry about so much about the
Right.
physical, the things on the earth, as we are the spiritual.
Right.
But all of that, God wants us to worry about all that. Why would he send Jesus in the flesh?
Right.
He's not worried about the flesh, right?
Right. Exactly.
So
All of it.
It kind of boggles my mind. How do you define social justice preaching? I know you do a lot of teaching on this and a lot of discussion on this. What must it include to be social justice preaching?
Okay, I thank God for my mentor, my friend and professor in seminary, Dr. Marvin McMichael. He taught us social justice preaching. He's one of the most well-known individuals in the country that preaches that. He states there's three basic areas of social justice preaching. The first is the abuse of power against those who cannot fight back. Okay, the abuse of power against those who cannot fight back. Economic injustice, in which people with money work to maintain others in poverty with corrupt policies and a lack of political agency. They constantly, systemically try to, as we see daily today, keep those who are oppressed, keep those who are poor. And so we have to stand up against that. And thirdly, idolatry, which is, again, pledging allegiance to false gods and assigning divine powers and reverence to human beings or inanimate objects. So individuals who continue to try to lift themselves up and oppress others and want to be elevated as gods and kings and, all that stuff we've been hearing in the media. So these are the forms of social justice preaching that was employed by the biblical prophets, which you spoke of earlier. Instead of these things, what we see today, false prophets are preaching about praise and worship only, about getting to heaven only, about being so heavenly bound that there's no earthly good, about getting our praise on, and that I know Christ for myself and forget about everybody else. There's preaching prosperity theology and respect of a king or governing authorities rather than the biblical truths that we need to be teaching and preaching. So those are three of some of the components that are needed as one preaches about social justice.
Let's talk a little bit about you. How did you know you wanted to be, or you were meant to be, a pastor? Now, this is usually asked, when did you know you were called? How were you called? Were you in the pulpit?
Well, the first part of that question, how did I know I was meant to be a pastor? I still don't, and I'm retired. I always knew as a child that I wanted to help people. At one point in time in my life, coming out of high school, I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to go into law. Well, God said, well, you can do law, but it's going to be ecclesiastical law, So as far as knowing that I was meant to be a pastor, I never could say that, just say, this is what I wanted to do. I know it was divine calling. It couldn't be nothing but divine calling because, when I was younger, I played in bands and stuff. I was supposed to have been playing with Kool and the Gang and Earth, Wind and Fire and all them guys, but God saw something different. And I'm grateful and thankful that God led me in that direction because it allowed me to be that voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. And then too, when King was assassinated, I think every young man during that time, and especially even myself, said we were going to be the next Martin Luther King. We were going to be the ones, those who felt that passion. So at an early age, I felt the passion to address injustice. Even in high school, I did my first, had my first action, as some people say, or work with. If some of the boys back in North Richmond at Richmond High School, what's up, my brothers? We had a boycott. In I think it was my freshman year in high school. Yeah, because Mama was there. Mama was a counselor at the high school I attended. I went to Richmond High. That was in the movie Coach Carter. So we were there and we did a boycott. So that was my first experience of doing that kind of action. Look, what we were boycotting was, of course, Black history was coming into the schools at the time, and it wasn't. So we were boycotting that. But also we were boycotting the cafeteria because we didn't have greens and cornbread, and we didn't have soul food like we eat it at home, But anyway, at that time. But social justice has always been a part of my makeup without even knowing it. And then it evolved into going into the ministry. Mm-hmm. Growing up when I did, where I did, during the era I did, it all came together. And when I felt the calling, because I knew I needed something, God was calling me to do something, I didn't know what. It was the only thing that, most people said was to go into preaching or go into pastoring or something like that. I still question that. It's okay to question God. And all through my pastorate, God, are you sure you want me to do this? Do you really? Yeah, but I'm grateful.
And you grew up in California?
Yes, ma'am. Northern California, Richmond, California.
Richmond, California.
Yeah.
You made your way across the country after that?
Ma'am, I'm sorry.
You made your way across the country for school?
Yes, because the church. I was pastoring in the Bay Area. My last church that I pastored in California was in San Jose, Lewis Memorial. And I was invited to pastor Lane Metropolitan in Cleveland, Ohio, in 95, I think it was. So I was there 7 years, which I can say from my own experience, growing up in California, when I did, the Panthers was down the street, hippies was across the street. I'm saying peace and love and power to the people in the same breath, like I tried to do then. Having that experience and then moving to Ohio, where I was mentored by Dr. Marvin McNichol, Dr. Otis Moss Jr. We hear his son, the third, all the time, but his dad was my mentor. William Myers, who was my professor at Ashland Theological Seminary, and McNichol was also in. So I got my practicum in Cleveland. We did a lot of things that dealt with social justice. Being the new kid on the block, they pushed me out there, and it was a great experience. Those 7 years was a great experience. And then from there, I was invited to go to Jacksonville. Same thing. We were involved in Jacksonville. This was right after that voting fiasco here in Florida. Uh-huh. And some of the brothers, clergy there, said, we got to fix this. Well, Jacksonville, as big as it is, it only had one early voting site, and that was middle downtown. So a group of us got together and said, well, we need to have more voting sites around the city. And we strategically pointed out, not just in the African-American community, but throughout the whole city. Mm-hmm. And so I recall, and I told Pastor Anita this the other day, and the group that I had presented the other day, I recall sitting at the dining room table, sitting at the dining room table at midnight with three other brothers. And we're strategizing on how we're going to do this. And we had been doing it for weeks. We had been going on and on. And we've been on TV, the newspaper, all of that publicity stuff. But we were out there trying to get this done. So sitting at the table at midnight, these brothers were talking about, hey, we may have to go to jail. this is a reality. We may have to go to jail. Well, I'm saying, well, somebody got to tell the story. Y'all go to jail, and I'll be outside telling the story.
You have
But
a different. Go on. I don't mean to interrupt.
no. But it was very, and all of a sudden, then we get Jesse coming in. We got all these other folk coming in when it was start rolling. But when the groundwork was being laid out, the foundation, when we were, being ostracized and talked about, by other clergy, you didn't see them, until Jesse shows up in town, and then everybody.
While you're talking about that, I wanted to give you a kudos for all the work that you do. And there are many like you. People in Boston area a lot of people think there's no resistance, if you will, in Florida, that everybody's just rolled over and, the other side, whatever you call the other side, is taken over. But there are a lot of people fighting for social justice in Florida. And it's always had that kind of resistance, correct?
Yes. I mean, as far as I've been down here, as long as I've been down here, and it's been a little over 20 years now, there's always been some element or some remnant of individuals who are fighting for justice. Yes, I think when I first moved down here, this was a purple state. And now it's definitely red as the blood of our ancestors. I go there every now and then, but yeah, it is. But we're still fighting. We're still fighting for justice. We're still standing in the gap. And we're going to continue to fight. Absolutely.
And I just want that to be said, because you guys, let me say, because I live now, we are on the front line. And so we have to keep up. We have to keep up this fight. But I just want to say that I thank all of those of you who are the warriors for justice, because you don't get a lot of credit down in Florida. And that speaks to who's controlling the narrative,
Right. That's
who's
right.
in charge of the talk. And maybe you're not doing the talking as much, but you are still doing the work. What a lot of people don't know, and I forgot to put in the introduction, is you're a musician extraordinary.
Are you too kind? You're too kind.
Your ministry, your music.
It's funny, you're just so kind. I love music. I just love music. As a kid, I always, played, playing clarinet from all the way through school. They wouldn't let me play sax because I wanted to be in the band. I wanted to be in the jazz band, not just the. But how I include that into music, how that started actually. I took my clarinet everywhere I went, just like I do my golf clubs now. I take my clarinet everywhere I went, and I took it to school with me. And I met my mom for Christmas one year in Beaumont, Texas. I was going to school in Oklahoma, and I met her in Beaumont, Texas. And there was a song playing on television. I'm saying, Mom, that song sounds familiar. And it was Amazing Grace.
Wow.
And I'm like, wow, and so she said, why don't you learn how to play it? My mama was the music director and all that at the church I grew up in. And she said, I want you to learn it. So when I went back to school, I learned the song, and I came home and I played it for her. She said, well, why don't you play it, at a musical for me or something, why don't you play it at church service? That's what it was. So I played Amazing Grace, and just my gospel thing went on from there, and we started a gospel group. So that's how the music came a part of my ministry, is that, before I became a pastor, before I even thought about preaching, like I said, really be honest with you, this is where the calling came in, actually. I was playing in a band and playing gospel at the same time. So I guess I was straddling the fence, so to speak. And I realized there was nothing wrong with either. I mean, doing both. So one day I'm playing in this band, and we decide we're going to get a sound system for the group. So we drive over to San Francisco. I worked in San Francisco. We drive over to San Francisco. The weather was inclement, but it wasn't raining yet. I had a brown Pinto, 74 brown, and it was clean. I always like to go there. And so going back to the East Bay, I had to turn around and come back to San Francisco. But a few nights earlier, or maybe I can't recall, but I remember trying to go to sleep that night, and there was a presence in my room, and I turned and was nothing there.
Ooh.
But during this time, I'm wrestling with the call. I've been talking to people. People have been encouraging me, sharing, pray about it, the whole 9 yards. And so this one incident, and I said, okay, God, I realized I felt to myself that it was the Holy Spirit in my room. And I said, okay, I'll do it. Now, granted, I couldn't sleep at all for a few days because I'm wrestling with this call thing. And when I said, okay, I'll do it, I slept like a baby.
Wow.
And I'm like, okay. So I still had some contemplating. And then right after that, that's when I had a bad car accident in that Pinto on the Bay Bridge. And I don't know if that was a sign, but I know from that point on, my life kind of started changing, but I still like playing jazz. I incorporated with my playing at the church, because the only difference between secular music to me and sacred music is the lyrics.
Right.
And I think I shared in Can We Talk one time or somewhere is that some quote secular, I don't even want to use that term, it's more spiritual to me than even some sacred music.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because of the lyrics or whatnot. So, but yeah, that's part of who I am, the music part.
I didn't say I was going to ask this, but what do you, in Can We Talk, you brought it up, we use music as part of our healing.
Yes.
And, it's a healing tool. How do you define the healing power of music? What is it about music that can heal a broken heart, can heal us emotionally and psychologically, and maybe even physically if we listen to that kind of music? Do you see it that way?
Oh, I do. And the healing part, especially if you start dancing around, get them joints going, you can I don't have a fan, I'm can put my first boots on the ground. But that part, you were out doing your book tour the last time we had Can We Talk, and the question what I did this time, and thank God I had just came out the hospital, so I didn't know if I could play. But what I asked the group, I asked, does each of them have a soundtrack or not a soundtrack, a theme song for their life? Is there a song that when you hear it, you say, that's my song? Not just that's your song because you like it, but it speaks to you spiritually, and it defines basically who you are. And so some of them had, different songs. Most of them were, of course, was going to be spiritual. But mine was Summer Madness. That's my song. That's my go-to. What it does, it takes me to that place of peace. It takes me to where I'm comforted, and it takes me away from whatever I might be dealing with at that time. Then I asked the question, do you have a soundtrack of your life? Meaning that regardless of what place you are in your life, there is a song that speaks to you at that particular point in time. It might make you cry. It might bring you joy. It might help you to reflect, but it also brings something spiritual into you, regardless of what the song is, so that you can start the healing process. And then what I did, I asked them to close their eyes, and I played like 4 different songs. And I forgot, because it got so good, I forgot to ask them, where did that song take you to? Songs they had never heard before. And afterwards, they would come to me and say that, or told me that, that song took me on, Pastor Nita said, that one song you played, it was an Earl Clue song, took me down a long road with a convertible. And how you let your hand go with the wind. And she said, that's where I was. And then the second song, she said, I was on the beach. And each time I'm by myself. So music speaks to us in so many different ways. And it might speak to us today in one form. Tomorrow it might speak to us to another form. But it's a universal language. It speaks to who we are as people. And as people of our culture, if we just hear a beat, our heads are going to start rocking. Even an infant, even an infant will start bouncing. Music speaks to us in so many ways.
Right. I think also music speaks when we can't find the words.
Exactly.
You hurt music.
Exactly.
And I just wanted to add my soundtrack is Jill Scott's "Living Life Like It's Golden."
Oh man.
That's what I am necessarily all the time, but that is
Yes.
sometimes
Yes. Yes.
live life like it's golden. It's such a joy
Yes.
to talk to you. You are considered an elder of wisdom and good counsel and guidance to scores of generations of young preachers all over the country, I imagine. What would be your greatest piece of advice to a young preacher today trying to navigate these shaky times we're in? I mean, how does a preacher tell a church to hold on when, we're all kind of barely holding on in some ways?
Yeah. For those young preachers, just stay true to yourself. You can't be someone else. Stay true to yourself, and people will see the realness and the genuineness out of you, especially when you start preaching to them, engaging with them on a regular basis, and when you and not be afraid to be grounded or be critical rather of your own theology and of your own doctrine. Challenge it. That's how I don't believe. I'm not a big proponent or proponent or opponent. Get my tongue tied. Regardless of evolution and all that stuff, I don't get into that debate. But I do evolve as a person, and to grow, you have to be able to be flexible. Flexible don't mean if you're too rigid, you break. Mm-hmm. Flexibility means you just bend and you come back. So, and you learn, and as much as you can learn, try to do that and be open to other faith traditions, other ideas. Reach out to other people. And so as we deal with the turbulent times, we realize we're not in it by ourselves, first of all. Secondly, you understand who you are in your theology, and not allow others to tell you that social justice or social gospel is not gospel at all. And again, like I said, be true to yourself and know that there is hope. There is hope. Another professor, friend, mentor of mine, J. Alfred Smith, out of Oakland, California. I wrote a paper in seminary, I think one of my first papers, and I think I was complaining about the congregation, and he said, you're an agent of hope. Regardless of the situation around you, you're an agent of hope. And although it appears bleak, it appears dim, that hope is maybe lost, we know that our hope is built on nothing less. Jesus' blood and righteousness. As a follower of Christ, that's what I would say. But I also believe it's going to take the faith tradition, and we've been bouncing around to heal. We're talking about healing the country. Right. It's going to take the faith tradition, the faith community rather, to do it. I remember Malcolm saying we can have after he came returned from Mecca, he said we can have we can be equal, we can have civil rights, but it's going to take Islam. Now I'm a young pastor coming up, and I'm like, Brother Malcolm, I hear what you're saying, but it's going to take Christianity. However, 9/11 happened, and I'm sitting in a Catholic church, big Catholic church in downtown Cleveland. I have a rabbi on one side, an imam on another side. I have a Buddhist priest sitting across from me. I have a monk sitting on the other side, a Sikh. All these clerics from all different faith traditions coming together. And it was almost like we were on the ship with Jonah. And the captain said, y'all start praying. Somebody's God is going to listen. But at the same time, I'm saying, this is what it's about. Wow. This is what it's about. It's about, and especially my dissertation was the three Abrahamic faiths working together on injustice, against injustice. Mm-hmm. So it's going to take the faith community to bring about a healing. Is the church going to heal, or is the church going to reconcile? As long as there's a human element, as long as there's a demonic force in the world, I hate to say, let's just say the true church the real church will definitely reconcile. They will definitely see the false teachings and come together. But
Now
but
you said
as
real church, Dr. John.
uh,
How do you define that, even loosely? How do you find the real church?
the real church, I think the real church would be that church that really teaches and when I say teach, I'm not talking about just Bible study, but by action. And that's what that Hebrew text talk about, action. When it talks about justice and righteousness, bringing justice into action is that righteousness part. Is bringing into action, showing the love of Christ and showing not just the love of Christ, but showing that we are in this thing to bring about a change in terms of the atrocities, the systemic racism and other systemic things that are oppressing people. The church that will show itself, not just talk about it, but actually show itself doing the work of Jesus. When we talk about the Christian church, and not just saying, "Are you saved? Do you know the Lord?" No. Let's show them. Let's show them what that looks like, and show them that we are all created in the image of God. And that's one of the foundations of, my theology, is that God created humankind in God's image. And once we get that right, seeing the humanity in you, I can't be human unless I see that humanity in you. And so until we see that we are all created in the image of God. Now, there was one individual in this area, a brother, African-American, went to a predominantly white church. And one of his Caucasian members came to him and said, and I got this from a pastor friend of mine who this individual told it to, said, this Caucasian went to him and said, "I know we're made in the image of God, but what image are you made in?"
Oh, Lord.
Yeah. And thought it was okay to say that, So that's why it's going to take the real church and the church that really practices the love of Jesus in the world and do the things that Jesus taught and preached about, as opposed to trying to do this individual Western theology, a theological view of what Christianity is, and do what really Christ taught.
And that's relational. It has to
relational.
be us.
It's all about relationship.
Can't be me.
Right.
What you and I'm going to wind this up now, but what gives you your greatest hope that we'll be able, or do you believe
No.
not our lifetimes, but will church be able to do it?
Yeah, my hope is in that God is sovereign. My hope is that God is sovereign, and knowing that God is sovereign, that God can do anything, even in light of what's going on now or in the future. Yeah, I want to see, I didn't want to see what my parents saw, and they didn't want me to see what they saw. And we probably don't see. I know we don't. It's all, clandestine and all that kind of stuff. But, see the things that they saw when we were growing up and whatnot, and before, our time. But I didn't want to see my granddaughters have to worry about, speaking out about their own bodies and their own race, their color, you're too ethnic because of how your hair is done up. And I didn't want to see young men worried about, being stopped by the police and all that kind of stuff. These things are some of the things we fought for, when we were at that age. Still years ago. Yeah.
And here we are there. But God can do the impossible.
God can do anything.
Okay. So that's the word that we're going to.
God can do anything.
God can do anything. That's the word we're going to leave you all with. John Wesley Walker, you're a giant among men and women.
Oh, thank you, sis. I appreciate you. See, I done went from cuz to sis.
In there. But we got Ken. That is definitely true.
That's it.
Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you for having me.
John.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all for joining us for From the Heart. And we'll be back next Tuesday for another compelling conversation, searching for healing and hope. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night, sis.
Night.
All right.